are going to now hear Dr. Koo talk to us a little bit more about high-impact practices.
Your lucky day. Well, what's that? There's that story, shoot me if you've heard this so many times before, of the bishop, the Anglican bishop in England who has long made plans to deliver his words at a rural parish, and he's about a half a mile out, and the vicar of the local parish meets him and welcomes the bishop and tells him how excited we are to have someone like you here for Sunday worship and so on. And they get to the church, this little pristine little rural church, and they walk in the door, and there are 3 parishioners. And the bishop looks at the vicar and says, "My good man, didn't you tell them I was coming?" And he says, "Sir, no, but when I find out who did, I'll really let them have it." So anyway, you probably expected me, and I'm glad that you're here. And I want to follow up, use this time, been invited, asked to spend some time following up, digging a little deeper, I guess is what the program says, but a closer look anyway at some of the things I introduced this morning. And this is labeled as a workshop, and I have to tell you that I don't really do workshops. But what I do is I blab some more like I did this morning. But what we have with a smaller group is an opportunity, and we have Jill with a microphone, and so, I will just put you to sleep if you don't find yourself thinking and asking questions and so forth. So anytime, if there's something getting clear or you want to, in fact, we can start right now with questions if you'd like. I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch. I want to, as I threatened, talk a little bit more about work as a high-impact activity, because I think it is really one of the untapped, high-potential areas for us to make a difference in the student experience, particularly, here we go again, when I talked about goal realization. It's one of the few things, it's the second most common activity, well, third fourth, if you buy the stuff about sleeping and socializing as being high. But I mean, in terms of what students do as part of their educational experience, they go to class, lab, studio, we hope, most of them, most of the time. And the second most common thing is that they work, either on or off campus. So anyway, that's enough about that. And I want to delve a little bit deeper into some other things about, what we know about writing, but I hope that leads us to think about or ask questions about, things that in which you're more interested. Does anybody have a burning, not something even a burning, but a question or a comment about what we did? Yes, sir. And when you speak, well, this is great. See, Jill, you didn't think you were going to have to do this. You got to run around now. Would you tell us who you are and where you're from and what you do? Not a speech, just like 9 words or something.
9 words. Michael Martis, University of Louisville. I'm the Dean of Students. I was curious, you showed a couple of slides about the high-impact practices and the impact, and you showed the one institution where they had used the variable, I think it was Hispanic or Caucasian, and whether they had been involved in 1, 2, or 3, and how that moved them up on their success rates.
Yeah.
On a national level, what's been the data nationally? I know we'd have to go back and look at our own institutions, but what you've seen in terms of one, a high-impact practice, and then the difference if they're involved in a second high-impact practice, how much that moves the needle of success.
We don't have data at the national level like this. So because what you got to do is you got to have institution-level data to connect persistence and or graduation rates with participation in one of these activities at the institution level. So we don't have it yet. AAC&U is working in a more or less systematic way with multiple campuses to get them to look at these days. The first thing we ought to do is on our own respective campuses, we need to do the backward chaining or begin collecting data now on a pretty, I'd say, straightforward template. I mean, this is something that the registrar and the IR folks could do together, but we got to have a record collection and record keeping system that's probably is more sophisticated than we got now. I mean, who's collecting this kind of information on your campus, right? You are? Oh, you have a question, okay. Right. Well, I'm not done with this part of my routine yet, so that's the first step. Bottom line is we don't have national data. What we can say nationally, and you have this information, I think, in the handout that came, we can tell from NESI, essentially, the characteristics of students who do them in a very, rough way, right? Race, ethnicity, transfer. In fact, I'm going to show you that in a little bit here. So we don't have it. But this kind of archival and or forward-looking data collection activity is important, especially if you got to convince somebody on your campus it matters. I'm now at the age where, data matters, don't misunderstand me, but when you know something works elsewhere, let's not delude ourselves any longer in thinking that we are so different and so unique here that it's probably not that way here. There's something in the organizational theory literature called the uniqueness paradox, where organizations, for-profit, not-for-profit, we all think we're unique. This isn't to say we don't have some distinctive elements to our campus culture and this kind of stuff. Right, Marianne? Yeah, that's right. But most of what you heard this morning, I bet my horse farm, boom, that you'll see the same pattern at your place. Maybe nuanced anyway. Yes?
Going to talk about this more in your presentation, but how do you go about operationalizing and identifying high impact? I know even just in the conversation of service learning, it's so hard to come to consensus on your campus because how many hours is it and how many reflections and how tied to the curriculum does it need to be? And so really, in order to track it internally on our campuses, how do we kind of agree upon, and is that something that could be done at a national level?
You get the gist of this question? What are the more granular characteristics of what determines, what makes something eligible for the label high impact? I'm going to lie to you and tell you that I'm going to explain that later, and hopefully she'll forget that I didn't. I don't know, but I want to say one thing now, and maybe I'll hint at some other things. First of all, if you look for, I think, a uniform, barometer or set of criteria, we're probably going to be not spending enough time on doing things that matter if we spend too much time doing that. So some service learning courses can have, I'm out of my comfort zone here, maybe 3 major reflective components in the course of a semester. Another could have 6, but perhaps the one with 3, if it's structured in a way and the nature of the experiences in between, the reflective periods are more pronounced and profound. You see what I'm saying? So I don't know that we'll ever get to a standard unit of analysis to determine. I will say this, though, and maybe you've done this over lunch or you'll do it on the way home and you'll get back to campus and you'll say, man, we got a bunch of high-impact practices here. And people are using that phrase now to describe things where they really believe, I'm not questioning that, but they don't have any data to show that the impact on students, and I think this is really where we want to spend our time, what kinds of measures do you have that show that when a student has done this particular thing, they benefit in these ways? We have NESI, which is very gross indicators, but there are other things we could be collecting along the way, and I'll come to some of those that might get a little closer to what you were asking about. We have another question back here. I think my standard response is, I'm going to get to that shortly. Hi.
Hi, Heidi Heemstra with CPE. I work for your old friend, Dr. Hayek. One of the things that we're working on with our current 5-year strategic plan at the state level is we worked with all the institutions to set targets for 2014-15 academic year. And when we have these conversations around something like the 6-year graduation rate, we hear, well, they're already sophomores, they're already juniors.
Can't make a difference now.
Exactly. So I wanted to ask you, so much of your presentation this morning was about the first year. When we look at, say, survival rates of the 2008 entering cohort, and we see that 10-15% that our institutions are saying they're still going to lose in the next 3 years, what are some ideas you might have for them and for us that would really work with that kind of population? Thanks.
Well, I mean, the good news is the fact that they've lasted this long actually gives you more leverage than you think you have, but not unless you do something, which is, I think, the nature of your question, right? So I don't claim to have, airlock tight answers to this, but I think we continue something akin to the kind of advising I think some of us have been talking about, which is more frequent communication. And, this is easy for me to say. It's really hard for us to do, but some of you have advising ratios of 250, 300, 350. Another way to think about this is the nature of the interactions that, how many of you are faculty and or staff at a university? Your job really is teaching, learning, advising, working with students outside the classroom. What is it the rest of you do? I mean, the rest of you don't do anything? But I think there are things that if we change the way we thought about our work, I'm sorry about this, but I'm going to go back to reflection, integration, and application. What is it we talk about when we talk with students, for example? Whether it's a faculty member in the classroom, whether I'm working with a student outside the classroom in career services or residence life, whatever the role is. I mean, there are even great role here for librarians. Anybody who has a contact with a student, if we step back and analyze the nature of our interactions with students, what are they? Are they responding to specific student questions, or do we take that question, turn it around, and put students in a situation where they are thinking about what's happening to them here? I'm going to show you some very straightforward examples when I get to this work thing, and I think those are transportable, generalizable to other kinds of interactions, both in class and outside of class. So hang with me here, and if you're not satisfied, you get your money back at the end of the day. Another question or two that's burning. I want to say just a couple things about, this is a reminder, of course you have a handout, but I want to say that while these are being touted as the set, surely there are other high-impact experiences on your campus, right? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking a bit more about a few of these, but I want to put in your mind's eye, surely there are others. But I want to, again, temper that by saying, don't go running out of here saying, we got a whole bunch more, Koo said we did, and I'm going back beating our chest and saying, we got a bunch more here, right? So we need to be, I think, a little more balanced and cautionary about what we are labeling. All right, but let's just think about what some of these might look like, what they might be. This is what I'm thinking, and so I'll just open it up here in a moment after I give you my two or three. And if you remember the characteristics of these, right? Students spend a lot of time and energy. They get a lot of feedback. They are interacting in substantive ways with peers and perhaps advisors, teachers, and so forth and so on. They publicly demonstrate competence in whatever the area is, and they're bringing information, learning, but from a variety of sources to do it. Those are just a few, and I'll refer to those later. So, how many of you were involved in literary activities as an undergraduate? You wrote for the student newspaper, or the literary magazine, or the yearbook, or something? I didn't know, I didn't reflect on this at the time, but I wrote under the byline, Headless Norseman. What's so funny? So I went to this little college, and their mascot was the Norse. It's a Norwegian Lutheran college, Norseman. Anyway, but I was the Headless Norseman, meaning that I wrote an anonymous column, which in those days you could slander anybody all the time for good, and And in theory, my identity wasn't known, which allowed me to speak truth to power and, you know, all that other kind of crap that we hide behind. And, but the point I want to make is, the way I remember it, I spent more time preparing and writing my Valentine's Day column in my junior year for that than any other product in college except my senior paper. I'm still giving the edge to the senior paper. And I did library research, you know, multiple drafts. I think I even read a paragraph to my roommate, which was something, you know, in those days. And I got so irritated when the daily editor cut that column by a third to make it fit, you know. But my point about this was, and as I've been talking with media over the last 15 years, they would always ask, they started to ask me, okay, what's the most important thing, single thing a college can do to engage, you know, its students, you know? And of course I came up with answers because that's what you do. But finally I got tired of it and I started to say, well, I'll answer, but before I answer, you tell me what the most powerful learning experience was for you as an undergraduate. These are national, regional, local media. What did they say? Writing for the Stanford Cardinal, the Harvard Crimson, the literary, by far. So, so I think this is the long-winded way in saying, I think working in that kind of capacity, right? A lot of time and energy being spent, your competence is being displayed publicly. So let's think about some others. Performing, choirs, bands, musical groups, creative arts, theater, dance, visual, other visual, physical art forms. How about, in the spirit of Kentucky Blue, how about intercollegiate sports, which we just bang on mercilessly, and for some good reasons. Have any of you ever been to, I never have, but I can imagine, University of Kentucky or University of Louisville basketball practice? A practice. Anybody seen these? Okay. What stands out in your mind about the nature of the pedagogical process?
It's organized. There's an intensity.
Hang on, that's going too fast. It's organized. Organized, meaning you think Pitino or Calipari goes into those sessions with an idea of exactly what he wants to have happen that day? That's a revelation. It's intense. What makes it intense?
I think there's a level of attention to detail and
Can you hear him? Okay, good.
a level of attention to detail and a seriousness about the work that you're doing.
Why is the work serious? What makes it serious? It's a basketball thing. What's serious about that?
The results matter.
Oh, results matter. Results matter. Let's come back to that in a minute. What were you saying?
I was going to say, they have a goal in mind,
Oh, the outcome is fairly clear.
and they learn over time.
But the outcomes, well, there's the global outcome, you know, more points than the other team. But during practice, that outcome becomes much more specific, much more individualized. There are multiple outcomes. Screening, blocking, you know, positioning, passing. You're looking at a most improved player his senior year in college. That's why I know these things. The feedback is loud. Results matter, meaning if I don't change my behavior in response to this feedback, it's not just me. I mean, I'll be picking up some pine on my butt, but the rest of the team, what happens? They aren't performing any better because I'm not responding to ways I can improve my performance in the context of this larger group. Results matter. It's intense. It's goal-oriented and directed to specific behaviors. Accountability. And it looks and feels like what?
Well, that you're accountable to each of your teammates and to your coach because your performance matters.
Remember how Aaron this morning talked about the power of the peer influence, right? I mean, and we feel it, I mean, let's, you know, at least I'll speak for myself. I mean, that's true when you are working with highly educated people who are passing judgment on the quality of your performance. Let's call it promotion and tenure, or annual review, or whatever it's called, right? But in this instance, I mean, we can't make every class or studio or lab. And by the way, these are the same kinds of things that make the studio lab experience so powerful. I mean, maybe the feedback isn't as loud and you don't hear the squeaks and most people aren't perspiring profusely as a result, but very similar kinds of components go into those kinds of experiences.
There's a high expectation as well. You mentioned that before about the expectation, but there's an exceedingly high expectation of what it means to be on that team.
The only way we're going to get better is if you do better. This status quo is not acceptable here for us to go to the national championship. So that, well, okay, yeah, that's very important. I mean, expectations are huge. Well, let's just stop there. Are we out of time yet? And how well we do this matters. I think that was, I mean, this is really where you were going with your question, I think, right? What would the template for high quality look like? And I don't claim to have an answer to that, except, of course I do. I have some things that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about adding or implementing a high quality activity. I'll come back to that in just a little bit. I think the implications for academic advising are huge. Academic advising across the nation is the single most despised university experience that students have, right? I mean, everybody, I mean, you know, most students are satisfied with it, but it's also funny in our data set, it's the single most powerful predictor of a student's satisfaction with the overall campus environment. I don't know why that is, but in this instance, it's because, as I said earlier this morning, the people who could most benefit are less likely. And you have one of the data displays in your handout shows this. Just in these two terms, the learning communities and service learning, the good news is that there doesn't seem to be differences in terms of the percentage of people from different racial ethnic groups. I think in part this is because more and more campuses are requiring these things in the first year. But you can see what happens. Fewer first gen, fewer part-timers. And I'm talking about academic advising now. How do students, and then in the senior year, someone said, if we're going to lose, who asked about what happens after the second, third year here, right? Well, we know that across the board now, from different ways of carving up the student characteristics data, that we have systematic disparities in terms of who does them and who doesn't. How does this happen? There may have been a discussion in my family. Remember, father's a truck driver. My mother did finish high school, my father didn't. There was never any discussion, I know, at my dinner table at home in high school about, for example, study abroad, or doing an internship, or doing research with a faculty member. These are the days that far precede, learning communities and service learning as a. But my point is, a lot of our students come to us and they don't have a clue that these opportunities exist. If we developed a checklist for academic advisors, and on that checklist was, as I was regaling some folks over lunch, if on that checklist was, every time you have the interaction with the student, it's a question about when do you intend to do this? Not have you thought about it, look at this list and let me know if you're interested, but it's putting in the student's mind's eye when. And, I think the implications for academic advising are huge here. That's part of what I mean by intrusive advising. I realize academic advising is more than telling people they ought to get into one of these activities, but we also need to be sure that advisors then can follow up with connections, a place to send a student who indicates signals and interest. All right, finally on this one. This is the most important point of my day with you. I was talking with a few people and they got it, and so let's all get it. The things that make a high impact, things that make an activity high impact, near as I can tell, can be infused in any classroom, lab, studio. These things are not, they seem to be organic. That's why they popped out as high impact, study abroad, learning communities, first-year seminars when designed intentionally. We can use these effective practices across the board in what we do, inside and outside the classroom. So, I mean, this is the list I showed you slightly earlier this morning, slightly reworded, right? There's nothing here that is terribly costly. It requires a sea change, however, in how many of us, many of our colleagues, think about what their primary job is and how to enact it, right? Making certain that students are aware of the expectations, i.e. clearly defining the goals for our work here together, right? In language that students will understand, not just what I will understand and you would understand if you were as smart as I am, but you aren't, and therefore I'm going to remind you that you don't understand the words I'm using, so I'm going to use big ones. There's a great Lives on the Boundary. Any of you know this book, Lives on the Boundary? And of course, I'm now can't remember the author's name, but this is a fellow who it's an autobiography, and near the beginning of his story is that he's a first-gen student, he's a devout Catholic, he's of traditional age, which makes him dualistic in the intellectual development, stuff, meaning that he's seeing the world in black and white terms, and he goes to college, and he is totally lost because he is in classes where he does not understand the words that the teachers are using, because these are words never heard around his dinner table. They're long, multisyllabic. And when you package this together, devout Catholic, you could be a devout anything. It's God's will that I should not be here. This is the way he's viewing the world. I don't belong. I don't have the intellectual ability to do this work. Obviously, everybody else around me must be smarter. Now, he hasn't spoken with anybody, of course. He is just, after 2 or 3 weeks, deciding he doesn't belong. Unfortunately, I can't remember what turns him around. But this is the guy who directs the creative writing program at UCLA, right? And maybe many of you have a similar autobiographical story. So finding language, once again, this is a kind of a sea change in the way we think about what our instructional roles. Well, I'm not going to go through those. We talked about them earlier. I just want to do whatever I can. If I could stand on my hands so that you would just take this one point away. We could make many more collegiate experiences high impact if we intentionally threaded together and took what Calipari and Patino, studio directors and so forth, where the work becomes meaningful because we're in it together and the expectations are such and yada, yada, yada. All right. Oh, no, we don't want to do this again. No, we're tired of this. But it's my segue into work.